D2 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh DeHaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's litigation director.
And I'm Joanna Barron, executive director of the CCF.
In today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about a new lawsuit arguing that the rights of people seeking medical assistance in dying from pure mental illness, that their rights are being violated.
I'll update you on the situation in the UK where scores of people have been arrested for statements they posted online.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to talk about a couple of proposed class action lawsuits in Alberta related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And before I get into these lawsuits, I just want to make clear that we're not involved at the CCF with them, and that's because our mandate requires us to focus on constitutional challenges, and these are based in tort law, like negligence. And obviously, we believe governments violated rights during the pandemic in many different ways, and that's why we launched charter challenges, including our challenge to being locked up arbitrarily in quarantine hotels, our lawsuit against Bonnie Henry in BC over her discriminatory vaccine passport program, and of course, our Emergencies Act judicial review. We're working on the appeal of that right now after winning back in January. So the first proposed class action here is aimed at both the federal government and Alberta, and the gist of the lawsuit is that public authorities misrepresented the safety and efficacy of vaccines, and that this led to serious injuries, death, and pain for members of the public, or so this lawsuit alleges. And the second lawsuit is just aimed at the government of Alberta, and it relates to losses suffered by businesses that were forced to close or that lost a lot of revenue during lockdown. And the first lawsuit alleges that the collective conduct of various health officials and politicians amounts to various torts, including conspiracy to commit assault and battery, negligent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, malfeasance in public office, etc. And like I said, this is a proposed class action, so it means somebody's applying to the court to represent a group of people who have some sort of common claim. And the proposed representative plaintiff here is a Lethbridge woman named Carrie Sakamoto. The proposed class that she would represent is anyone who suffered injury, damage, or loss from the 5 COVID vaccines that were available in Alberta. Sakamoto's story is pretty hard to read. She did what officials told her to do, and she received the AstraZeneca vaccine followed by the Pfizer vaccine. And immediately after the Pfizer vaccine, she had flu-like symptoms, which I think a lot of us had. And in her case, they just got worse and worse. And after about 2 weeks, she headed to hospital, where on the way to the hospital, she noticed her face was drooping. And soon she found herself on a feeding tube because her throat was paralyzed, according to this claim. An eye was paralyzed. She lost hearing in one ear. She lost her balance. She experienced memory loss. And apparently these symptoms, some of them like headaches, pain, vertigo, continue to this day. And according to the lawsuit, it sounds like she was diagnosed with Bell's palsy, which is a pretty common, well, not a common side effect, but it's a known side effect of various vaccines. And according to the claim, a doctor told her that this was caused by the vaccine. And one point I noticed in here that I thought was pretty sad was that she went to CBC News with her story, and they basically refused to cover it. And I think we already all remember that time where we were hearing lots of stories about people potentially injured by vaccines, and the media essentially ignoring those stories. So as everybody knows, the federal government was aware from day one that some people might get injured by these vaccines, since no vaccine is completely safe, and drug companies weren't willing to take on that liability since it was immense considering how novel the vaccines were. So they set up a vaccine injury support program, which is taxpayer funds for those who end up injured. And notably, Sakamoto was given what the lawsuit says, what it calls modest compensation from this fund. And the claim points out that Health Canada has reported 488 deaths after COVID vaccines, 58,712 adverse events after the vaccine, including 11,702 listed as serious. And personally, I think there were probably more reports out there that doctors were reticent to put forward, so we don't really know the real number. What they don't say, though, is how many Canadians receive these vaccines, and we know that that was in the tens of millions, but they also don't say is how many Canadians' deaths or injuries from COVID might have been prevented by the vaccines, which is really important context to keep in mind. But for them, for these plaintiffs or these litigants, that's not really the point. What they're saying the point is that government officials claimed repeatedly that the vaccines were safe and effective when, in their view, it wasn't even possible to really know that, considering how quickly this particular process of approval of the vaccine went forward. So they note that there's research that has shown a lot of side effects linked to the vaccine, including myocarditis and pericarditis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is what this plaintiff apparently has, and cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which is a pretty nasty form of stroke. And they point out that a lot of this research was available pretty early on, but that the governments continued to say basically the same thing, which is that these are generally safe and effective. The other proposed class action here, which is just against Alberta, alleges that businesses were essentially expropriated without compensation during lockdowns, and they also allege negligence and abuse of power. And this one has two proposed class representatives. The first one being the owner of the Whistle Stop Cafe, which is a restaurant, gas station, and campground in Mirror, Alberta. And the other is Rebecca Ingram, who's a gym and retail shop owner who lost a lot of revenue from the COVID rules. And what happens next? Well, the court will have to decide whether to certify these. And I don't know enough about class actions in Alberta to really opine much on the chances of success getting certified. But I do have a few thoughts. And one is that on the vaccine lawsuits, some of these torts, like malfeasance in public office, are really hard to prove. And I think it's also noteworthy that there is already this vaccine compensation fund out there, and normally you can't recover damages twice. So I'm not sure how the court will feel about that. As for the idea that businesses were expropriated, I share a lot of the anger from the people whose businesses were closed. I think a lot of businesses should not have been closed, or that they were closed too long, or that the rules were arbitrary. But there is a legal test for constructive taking, which I think is what we're talking about here. And it's from the Annapolis and Halifax case that we intervened in at the Supreme Court. And the bar for showing like a constructive taking is pretty high. You first have to show that the state got a beneficial interest in respect of a private property. For example, in Annapolis, the state gained essentially a free public park because they regulated private developer land in a way that it couldn't be used for anything other than as parkland. And the regulatory measure also needs to remove all reasonable uses of a private property, which strikes me as the harder part to prove in a case like this, because there often is some reasonable use of property, even if the government has essentially regulated your business almost to death. So the other question I have is about limitations. I won't get into that, but we're obviously more than a couple of years out from some of these COVID restrictions and vaccinations. And I think that's probably all I want to say about these lawsuits for now. I'll put links to them on our website in case anybody's interested in reading the statements of claim. Joanna, what are your thoughts?
So I think that it's a good point that it was probably impossible. There was no objective, reliable data at the time that the federal government, and of course, most governments around the world, started pushing the vaccines. And for me, the kind of like penny drop moment when I realized how much more skimpy the evidence was the article. It was a really long article. I don't know if you guys remember this, sometime maybe in late 2021 by a doctor named Norman Doidge in Tablet magazine called Needle Points, that just went through the fact that the broad population, the phase 3 trial of the Pfizer vaccine was like 4 weeks long. And that had just been completely passed by the collective consciousness. So it's not even that they lied about it. It was just, it just faded out in the narrative that vaccines were a social imperative and safe and effective. Having said that, I'm extremely skeptical of the class action lawsuit pertaining to the vaccines and the vaccine injuries, being certified or going ahead just because, and it's the same pattern that we observe to be going on again and again and again with the courts. And I just think it will repeat, even though we're past peak COVID pandemic hysteria, which is just there will be some appeal to the exigencies and the reasonableness of the government in making a decision during like a fast moving, urgent situation. It would certainly it would, give me hope. And it would be wonderful to see somewhat of a retraction from that knee jerk posture. But I'm just very skeptical because it was a complex decision, right? I don't think a complex decision can justify misrepresenting the basis of the assertion to the public. Because, of course, it is true that for the overwhelming majority of people, the vaccines were safe and effective. All three of us got vaccinated. Our families got vaccinated, and thank God. Well, with the exception of Christine's fainting episode, which maybe you can talk about, we're all fine. But there were people who died from the vaccines, and people who have suffered long-term injuries. And I think that the reason that we have individual protections is we can't just dismiss that in the name of the collective good. Christine, I know you have some thoughts about this.
Yeah. So what do you want me to talk about? I guess I can tell you my fainting story, which
Yeah, you should.
mean,
It was the most dramatic, as always. Most dramatic COVID story, at least in the wild, most dramatic vaccine story.
I would say there's some confounding factors about my fainting. So we went to, I went and got my first, I think it was my first or second dose.
No, it was your second dose.
Okay,
I remember.
It was my second dose.
And I think your second dose was Moderna.
You remember this way better than me.
I remember so well. I remember you were like, I'm in the line. I'm about to get the vaccine. Do you want to like take an Uber up to somewhere in north of Etobicoke? And I was like, I'm good. I'm like, I don't have to be the very first person to get this shit.
So, okay, like a few hours later, I went out with some girlfriends in the neighborhood and I fainted at the restaurant. I was like sitting, having a sangria, and then I got really dizzy and I just fainted. But I will also say, like I had had the vaccine a few hours earlier, but I also it was a really hot day. It was like one of those days, it was like 32 degrees out. And my friend was also telling me a disgusting story that like her brother is an ER doctor and he told some really disgusting story about a patient who had come in. I don't want to give you the details because it's really gross. It involved a Harry Potter wand and a small boy.
Okay.
And I like was drinking the sangria. It was really hot, was disgusted by this story. I don't know if I was also agitated from my vaccine dose and I fainted and like I woke up and this fireman was carrying me to an ambulance. So that's my
Wow.
Didn't you say the waitress tried to dump cold water?
Yeah, they poured water on me. I woke up and they were pouring cold water on me, and then I think I fainted again. I was like in and out of consciousness. I woke up all wet. It was really it was not a pleasant experience. But I can't say that it was entirely because of the vaccine. It may have also had to do with this disgusting Harry Potter wand story and the heat and the alcohol. So I don't know. There may be some contributing factors there. But did you want to say something, Joanna?
No, we're probably not going to try and certify a class action on the basis of your experience. I'm not going to Harry Potter wand, the heat of June in the GTA.
Yeah, I'm not going to attempt to join the class.
No.
My harm was also not very serious. But what I would say about this is, so first of all, no, I actually used to work in class action litigation when I was in civil practice, when I was not in constitutional work. And the thing that's interesting is that this is a going after the government. I think that's a harder case to make than going after the pharmaceutical company themselves. A lot of what I did was litigation related to pharmaceutical products. But in this case, as I guess everybody probably is aware, the pharmaceutical companies are shielded from liability for these vaccines, and as they are for a lot of vaccines. So there's no option to sue for damages, to sue the pharmaceutical company because they're shielded by legislation. Another thing I would point out is, remember when all these courts were taking judicial notice of the safety and efficacy of the vaccines? maybe that wasn't such a good idea because now the vaccines are being sued for causing harm. So, I mean, this is why judicial notice of things that are not irrefutable facts like gravity or, the earth being round, these are things that the court can take judicial notice of, and perhaps the safety of novel technologies is not something that judicial notice should be taken of, because imagine if the court
Here,
in this
here.
case takes judicial notice, like, nope, your case is done. We can just take judicial notice that these people were not, in fact, injured by the vaccine, even though you have evidence that they were. So, big problem that we saw throughout the pandemic. I guess I'll go to my news headline now, which is a different topic. It's about a new charter challenge that was just launched against the federal government. So we have a theme here, I guess, of suing the feds. This lawsuit is about medical assistance in dying, or MAID, and mental illness. So in March of this year, MAID was supposed to expand to include people with mental illness, meaning that you could apply for MAID or euthanasia just because of a mental illness, not because you had a death that was imminent or even reasonably foreseeable. But the federal government at the end of January, they introduced legislation that delayed that expansion until 2027. And this followed recommendations of a parliamentary committee that had warned Canada's government healthcare system is not ready for the expansion of MAID to pure mental illness. So it is that delay that is now subject to a charter challenge by a group called Dying with Dignity, as well as by two individuals who want access to MAID for mental illness. Now, I'll give you a little background for those of you who have not been following the MAID saga. MAID has been legal in Canada since 2016. The year prior, the Supreme Court of Canada had struck down criminal code prohibitions in a case called Carter in Canada. And in that case, the court was considering sections of the criminal code that said everyone who aids or abets a person in committing suicide commits an indictable offense, and that no person may consent to death being inflicted on them. So those prohibitions, those criminal code prohibitions, were struck down for violating Section 7 of the Charter. They were struck down in 2015. There was a transitional period of I think a year, and then the government introduced legislation. But I'll explain sort of the court's reasoning. They said that the criminal code prohibition deprives some individuals of life, as it has the effect of causing these individuals to take their lives prematurely at their own hand instead of using a more, I guess, dignified process, because they're fearing that they're going to be incapable of taking their own life later when their suffering is more intolerable. So the court also said that there were Section 7 concerns about autonomy and quality of life, and that an individual's response to a grievous and irremediable medical condition, and those are the key words, grievous and irremediable, that those are matters crucial to their dignity and autonomy, and that the prohibition, the criminal code prohibition, denies people in those situations the right to make decisions concerning their bodily integrity and medical care, and then infringes on their liberty by leaving them to endure intolerable suffering, and also infringes on their security of person by leaving them in this intolerable suffering. So that was the Carter decision from, I guess, almost 10 years ago now. So the federal government responded to Carter with Bill C-14 that made it clear that to access MAID, you needed to meet certain criteria. You needed to be over 18, you needed to be mentally competent, you needed to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. That was the language from the Supreme Court Carter decision. And that means that you need to have a serious disease in an advanced state, experiencing physical or mental suffering, and be at the point where your natural death is reasonably foreseeable, even though the condition need not be fatal. And you also need two nurse practitioners or physicians to consent to MAID. So that criteria from C-14 would have excluded mental illness from eligibility. Now, in Truchon, there's another case a few years later called Truchon, which was a Quebec case. And in that case, the law the C-14 law was challenged on the basis that people who wanted MAID, like Miss Truchon, who had, I think she had cerebral palsy, that her rights were being violated by this requirement in C-14 that her death be reasonably foreseeable. And the court agreed with Truchon and struck down the reasonable foreseeability and end of life requirements on the basis of the charter. And the government, the federal government, did not appeal that decision. And in 2020, in response to Truchon, they introduced Bill C-7, which would have expanded MAID for mental illness. But they said it would not come into effect until later. And then since then, we've gotten to this sort of pattern of repeated extensions, including the current one, which has delayed MAID for mental illness until 2027, which, of course, I will point out, is after the planned 2025 federal election. And that's an election that the current Liberal government could lose. I mean, based on the current polls, it looks unfavorable to them. And we know as well that the current Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, has said he would not permit MAID for mental illness. So a bunch of things going on here. I will also point out that there have been a lot of reports that people have already been applying for and been granted MAID or euthanasia because of mental illness as the sole underlying condition. We have seen a number of these reports covered in the media. And technically, that is not supposed to be happening. Technically, these people probably were approved for a different reason, some other grievous and irremediable condition other than mental illness. But as we know, these things can overlap. So technically, MAID is not available right now solely for mental illness, even though in practice, it seems to have already been happening. So that brings us to this week. A charter challenge was filed by this group, Dying with Dignity, as well as the two individuals who want to access MAID. And the basis of their claim is that the delay is a violation of their Section 7 and 15 charter rights. Section 7 being what the court considered in Carter, that it's a violation of their right to security of person, their right to life, the life argument being that they might try to take their life earlier without MAID, or that they may not be even able to take their own life because their condition has deteriorated. Carter did not consider Section 15 because they struck it down on the basis of Section 7. Section 15 is the protection for equality rights. So the Dying with Dignity claim says there's no constitutional justification for prolonging the intolerable suffering of those with mental disorders, and they claim that it perpetuates stigma against them. So this is an interesting challenge because it's a challenge to the delay itself. And I guess that it's partly strategic because of the concerns that this group might have that the expansion may not happen because the Liberals might lose the next election and then the Conservative government may not permit MAID. They'll cancel the extension at all. There are a bunch of timing issues as well, since I think if the Liberals do lose and the criteria for MAID is changed by a new government, the court challenge might either be moot or it might have to be entirely reformulated. And if it's reformulated, how realistic is it that this is going to be resolved by the courts by 2027? Anyway, probably highly unrealistic. So they're suing over a delay that will probably be resolved by the time this gets to the Supreme Court, if it goes to the Supreme Court. In addition to all of those sort of strategic questions, I think that the questions around MAID itself are really fascinating and complex, not just legally, but morally and ethically. And I know that everyone holds really strong views on this. And there's sort of a question about the courts answering moral and ethical questions versus the role of Parliament in making those determinations. And I have my own personal views. I think everyone has their own personal views about this. And I've done a few episodes of my show, Canadian Justice, about MAID and mental illness, where I've interviewed psychiatrists. Like I interviewed the head of psychiatry at one of Ontario's hospitals who, look, he is not a conscientious objector, but he has raised serious concerns about what guardrails are in place to protect vulnerable populations from being pressured or even coerced into MAID, which he said can happen, and which we've seen some media coverage suggesting this is happening. There's also the other moral question about minimizing suffering, about the questions of autonomy. So I really think that it's not an easy topic, and the government is trying to strike a balance here. And I guess, I mean, they're trying to strike a balance in all of that, including ensuring the guardrails are in place. And I guess this new lawsuit brought by Dying with Dignity is going to now have the courts review how well that balance is being struck. So, Josh, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, like you and Joanna and all Canadians, I think I have like some conflicted views on MAID in general. But in terms of the lawsuit, I think it's obviously strategic, like you say, and I wonder if it's the type of thing where we could see the notwithstanding clause used if the court does say you have a right to do this, because I think there's pretty strong support in Canada if you look at polling for having a MAID option. But I think what most people picture is someone's very close to the end of life. They have that grievous and unfixable medical condition, because maybe they have cancer or something, they're in a lot of pain, and the end is very clearly close, and they don't want to suffer through that. Like, I think a lot of Canadians are on board with that. But what we're talking about here is what they do in the Netherlands, for example. And my friend Rupa Subramanya wrote about this in the Free Press about a woman who was 28 at the time. She did the interviews, and her only medical condition was mental health, but she had a pretty good life, and she had a boyfriend, and she just said she was suffering from mental health conditions. I believe she might have also had autism, although I can't say that for sure. And the system allowed her to die, and I just think that's so wrong, because so many people that I've known in their 20s are depressed, or they have really bad anxiety disorders, or they have other uncontrolled mental illness, and they get through it, and then in their 30s they end up thriving. So I think for a lot of Canadians, they would recoil at the idea that people with mental illnesses would be able to get euthanasia when they're 18 or 20 or 28 or something like that. So I think this is a whole different situation than the current MAID regime, and I think it'd be like politically explosive if a court were to, side with dying with dignity on this one.
On the polling, by the way, I had looked that up before doing my summary of what's happening, and there is broad support for MAID generally for irremediable terminal conditions, but there's not widespread support for MAID for mental illness. It's below 50%. I think it says it's around 42%. Joanna, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we are a group that does public interest litigation. We think it's perfectly appropriate for courts to play empire and weigh in on the constitutionality of legal regimes. I will say, in this particular case, it feels like we're a court to opine on this based on the snapshot that Dying with Dignity, and I'm sure there will be interveners. I hope there will be like a fulsome representation of interveners, because the real benefit to a legislative process, and I had a good friend who was involved in the consultation and the testimony leading up to the adoption of C-14. And they really, they took what they heard from conscience groups and religious groups very seriously. That is one thing I can say, that Jody Wilson-Raybould left a really strong legacy, and they took it very seriously, and they took the moral controversies very seriously. My concern would be that there's going to be a slanted picture here, because while there very, very well may be Section 7 and Section 15 rights in play for mentally ill people, and I certainly don't discount the severity of mental illness. I have people in my own family who have severe mental illness issues, but there is another side of this picture, right? Like, there are real concerns, non-trivial concerns, from individuals with disabilities, that this is going to make them feel even more sort of pressured by the system to consider MAID. And I just think the more loose we get with when the state is going to have this as a policy, and we know that once it becomes a policy, the healthcare system kind of seizes on it, not because they're evil or want to murder people, but because we are a ration system and we run at full capacity. So all of which is to say that there are serious Section 7 and Section 15 concerns, probably on multiple ends, not even to speak about the institutions that are going to be carrying out these procedures, and the individuals and physicians and technicians and nurses that are going to be involved in this. So we'll be watching this very closely. Okay, why don't we take a break, and then when we'll come back, we will talk a little bit about the UK riots. Okay, so obviously this summer has been a pretty grim one in the UK, although I was glad to see that they got to have their Taylor Swift shows, unlike Vienna. The riots have been going on, and what we have been particularly watching, what I want to talk about, is that this has been an interesting sort of collision course for what happens when speech crime and real life disorder and social panics intersect. So we were particularly struck by the story of Julie Sweeney, who is a 53-year-old woman who is a primary caretaker for her elderly husband. She lives in a area of England called Cheshire, and she posted a pretty vile comment in a local Facebook community group in the aftermath of the rioting at Southport. She posted, "It's absolutely ridiculous." And this was in response to a photo of people cleaning up in the aftermath of some of the riots. It's absolutely ridiculous. Don't protect the mosques. Blow the mosques up with the adults in it. And she deleted her account as well as the comment. I think in a few hours afterwards, she was very contrite about this. But in any event, we know that 3 police cars came and showed up at her house, arrested her, and within the space of a few days, she was sentenced to 15 months custodial imprisonment, and she had pleaded guilty to a provision which is under the UK's Online Safety Act called sending communications threatening or serious harm. And Julie Sweeney is not the only person that has been charged for online speech crimes over the course of these riots. At least 29 people have been charged since the outbreak of the riots, and a little bit of background of the unrest, which has mostly targeted Muslims and so-called migrants, or in many cases, falsely identified migrants, followed the tragic deaths by knife of 3 young girls, by a boy who turned out to be a UK-born citizen, but rumors had spread that he was a Libyan Muslim refugee. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about who is spreading those rumors. So let's go back to Julie Sweeney and her Facebook post, which is obviously racist, odious, contemptible. But when you talk about the criminal law, you want a very clear and sort of cut and dry burden of proof. And there's at least a reasonable argument that this was a very intemperate, spur of the moment outburst, just like a worst type of racist Karen auntie, rather than an actual call to burn down mosques and violence. And it's certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt that when she posted this, she truly did want people to go out and burn down mosques with the adults in them. People say all kinds of awful stuff that nonetheless shouldn't land them in prison, which is the highest state deprivation of liberty. And thinking about this and some of the nasty things people have said online, just in recent memory, there was a certain leftist Canadian academic, who I don't think I'll name, who tweeted after RBG died and Trump was rushing to get a new nomination for the Supreme Court of the U.S. He tweeted that we should burn down Congress before Trump could get any further in that. And there was a lot of pearl clutching and Ezra Levant types calling for him to be arrested. Completely ridiculous, right? Clearly, as he later clarified, he didn't literally mean burn down Congress. There was also the case of the former head of the BCCLA, Civil Liberties Association, that tweeted that you should burn it all down in response to burning of Catholic churches. She lost her job for it, but do we really want people to be going to jail for these nasty outbursts that they have? And the problem with these speech laws, such as the UK's Online Safety Act, is that they're very vague. So when do you know that the threshold has been crossed? Is there a close enough nexus between the speech and some actual intended or proximate violence? Are we looking at hurt feelings? Are we looking for emotional pain? It's extremely subjective. And in terms of spreading rumors, which many people are liable of doing, another case that I'll bring up is a woman named Bernadette Spofford, who is a 55-year-old woman who looks like is some type of sort of swish business owner. Like, she has all of these glamour shots when you look up her case on Daily Mail. And apparently she was patient zero for actually tweeting the rumors about the identity of the Southport killer. She tweeted that the suspect was someone named Ali al-Shakati, who was already on the M16 watch list, had arrived in the UK illegally by boat, and she posted this with the caveat that if this is true, then all hell is about to break loose. She was also arrested for spreading false communications under the Online Safety Act, even though in this case she may have recklessly, but she may genuinely have not known that this was false. Rumors spread like wildfire. And she deleted it a few hours later, but apparently not fast enough for this rumor to pick up and get picked up by RT and other nasty actors. But we also know throughout the course of the riots that false information has been spread from all corners, and the crackdown seems to be somewhat selective. There was a fellow named Nick Lowles who runs an anti-racist organization which is called Hope Not Hate. And he tweeted out that over the course of the riots, a Muslim woman had been doused with acid. This had been shown later to be false, and he received no police caution or charges for this. And so Douglas Murray had a good piece in The Spectator last week that made the point that basically you see a pattern of enforcement over these last 2 weeks, that people with power and proximity to the regime and who broadly are sort of in line with the ideological leanings of the regime, they're not the ones that are being enforced against. It's the quote unquote deplorables, the undesirables who are being arrested, are being made examples of. And criminal culpability is supposed to be about individual moral responsibility. It's not supposed to be about the particular ideological leanings. And you see this I've looked at, I think on the Line podcast, which is one of my favorite Canadian politics podcasts. Matt Gurney was talking about this the week before last, is just like the impressive speed by which a lot of these riot individuals, some of whom participated in the physical riots, of course, but also those charged with speech crimes, how quickly they were moved through the system and charged and sentenced. So I was looking at a few of the sentencing decisions that we already have, and several of them, the judge explicitly says, maybe in ordinary circumstances, this wouldn't be suited for a custodial sentence, but given the quote unquote sensitive social climate, custodial sentence for something like a tweet was seen to be fitting. And so I just want to make a few comments about some lessons that we might be able to take from this, because the UK is a society that I think broadly has some of the same DNA as Canadian society, and certainly some of the same tensions. So there's absolutely no reason why something like these horrible riots and the horrible outburst of racism and anti-immigrant sentiment that we've seen over there's no reason why it couldn't happen here. And we also have similarly draconian, broad and vague speech laws, particularly if the Online Harms Act comes into play. So the Online Harms Act famously introduces a standalone hate crime offense that is punishable by a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. It creates an offense for future hate crimes, and it increases the penalty for the crime of advocating genocide from 5 years to life. And arguably, something like Julie Sweeney, Burn the Mosque Down with all of the adults in it, that could possibly be caught under advocating genocide. So not only would it be possible that she would receive a custodial sentence, but she could be pressured to plead out in exchange for an even longer sentence, an even 5 to 10 year sentence. I don't think where life imprisonment is within the sentencing range, that's not like a hyperbolic outcome. And the last thing I'll say is that a lot of the federal government's defense of online harms has been, yes, on paper, we have these draconian possible sentences, but when it actually trickles down and is implemented by the system, moderation will come into play. Judicial discretion will, put the brakes on some of these more extreme hypotheticals that critics of the bill were bringing up. And I think the UK example shows that exactly the opposite will happen, that when there's an outburst of social panic, where there is a perception that a particular group is causing the social disorder, in this case, these right-wing anti-immigrant individuals, judges will be caught up in that fury as much as the media and as much as the public. And so we should really consider whether there are adequate protections and whether these are the types of criminal outcomes that we want to see. So, Christine, what do you think? You have gone toe to toe with some of these government spokespeople, some of whom accused critics of the Online Harms Act of rage baiting. And what do you think the UK example possibly can tell us about how it would play out here?
I think if we were to ask the advocates of Bill C-63 what they think of what happened to this woman and what the charges were, I think they would be entirely supportive. Now, if you were to ask a politician, they would not answer the question because they never do. But I think, the people who support C-63, this is the outcome that they're looking for. I believe that 100%. And this is what they want to happen in Canada. They would say this is the right outcome because they don't like what this woman said. Obviously, I don't like what she said either. It's horrible. It's a horrible thing to say, but horrible things are not automatic jail time. Like this to me looks like an angry, bitter woman tweeting awful things, not an actual call to do literally what she's saying in the tweet. And that's not to excuse the tweet. I think it's really bad and terrible and disgusting, but not everything bad and disgusting should lead you to jail. Now, one thing I wanted to add was I think the news just came out today that you were talking about the sort of origins of the misinformation about this guy who stabbed the little girls. And there was a woman in Britain who tweeted about it, but there was actually a source of misinformation originating from Pakistan. And this just was released today. So Pakistani police today arrested a man and charged him with cyber terrorism for his role in spreading misinformation that led to the riots in the UK. The suspect was identified as Farhan Asif, and he's a freelance web developer in Punjab province. And he was accused of spreading misinformation from YouTube and Facebook. And I believe it came from a channel he ran, a news channel called Channel 3 Now. And that led to this sort of dissemination of this. Now, calling it look, Pakistan is not a paragon of liberal values, but charging him with cyber terrorism that's an interesting look. It's definitely a step beyond what the people in Britain who spread the misinformation would be charged with. Look, I don't know more detail other than those are the charges and that's the man's name and that's the sort of source of it, but definitely an interesting development.
Yeah, that is.
Josh, what about you?
Yeah, I'm really disturbed by the sentence this woman received, and I mean, obviously, rioting is a crime. Obviously, you can't, violently attack property. You can't burn things down. You can't attack mosques. And if somebody says, let's go to this mosque and burn it down and get these people because I hate Muslims, like to me that is crosses a line where it could be criminalized. But the issue here is if you read her comment, you don't get the sense that she really means what she's saying here. It's just one of those stupid, intemperate comments, and now she's going to be in jail for a very long time. So to me, the issue is the extreme sentence that she got. And, that's one example. There's so many examples. Like there are 29 people at least that have been arrested for pure speech crimes under this new act. And Joanna, you mentioned a couple of those, but there are also a lot of people that look like they're being arrested for using other criminal provisions where essentially what they're being arrested for is more or less speech crime too. Like this, I got sent an article by a friend this morning about this guy who just got 20 months in prison, and the charge that he faced was violent disorder. So basically participating in the riot after he was told to go home. And I'll just read you what this BBC article says. It says, Bristol Crown Court was told that this guy, his name's McCarthy, was arrested by officers for breach of the peace and later released, but remained in the area. And it says, quote, instead of taking that as a sign to go home, he could later be seen on video shouting at police officers and shouting in a police dog's face. And he was seen on video threatening counter-protesters and goading protesters to cross the police line. So this guy's going to jail for 20 months because he went to a protest that turned into a riot. He refused to go home, and he yelled in a police dog's face, yelled at left-wing counter-protesters, and goaded other people to cross the police line. Like, that's all he did. He didn't commit any violent act, and he's going to jail for 20 months, at least according to this BBC story. So, hundreds of people have been rounded up, and they're apparently going to clear 5,000 people out of UK prisons so that they can put rioters and other people in jail. And I just think, while a lot of these things that are happening are crimes, it just shows how you can get into this sort of social panic where people are getting extreme sentences for things that are bad, that they shouldn't be doing. But I just think it's going way too far. Anyway, enough about that. Let's go to our bad legal takes. Maybe I'll go first today. So my bad legal take, it's going to sound a bit familiar to listeners of the podcast because it's yet another city council deciding to limit free speech in the name of supposed civility. And it's a new policy passed by Whitehorse City Council. And it might be the worst I've ever seen. It says that people who want to attend a council meeting won't be allowed to bring in signs at all, which, as Christine has mentioned, there's already Ontario case law that says that is not minimally impairing limit on people's rights. You should be able to go to a council meeting with signs. You shouldn't be able to, heckle and stop the meeting, but signs are speech. They're protected, and municipal governments need to respect the charter. The policy also says, this is my favorite part, it says people can engage in microaggressions, which, as we all know, is this kind of overplayed woke concept. But the way the policy defines it is this: comment or action that subtly and often unconsciously or unintentionally expresses a prejudiced attitude toward a member of a marginalized group. In other words, you can't make comments that unconsciously or unintentionally express a prejudiced attitude. And I'm not really sure how you're supposed to understand what your unconscious is doing. But anyway, it also says you need to demonstrate civility. And the way they define this is reflecting a concern for others, and is usually demonstrated through manners, courtesy, politeness, and a general awareness of the rights, wishes, concerns, and feelings of others. I don't think you need to be aware of the rights, wishes, concerns, and feelings of others if you want to be able to speak at a public meeting, but apparently Whitehorse thinks you should. It also says that clothing can be banned if it's not in line with civility, and this includes buttons, non-religious headwear, pins, other items if are not appropriate in the opinion of the presiding officer. It has language, statements, or imagery that is detrimental, discriminatory, offensive, profane, racial, sexist, violent, or vulgar will not be allowed. And yes, all of those grammar errors are in the civility policy, so they might want to use an editor next time. Anyway, these are really serious infringements on freedom of expression. Obviously, there is we support civility to some degree in city council meetings, but who decides what's civil? And obviously, this goes just way, way, way too far. So, something we're going to look into a little bit more as soon as this podcast is over. Christine, let's hear your bad legal take.
Yeah, so my bad legal take is about some reaction I've received to a paper I wrote this last week for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So my paper was about professional regulation and censorship. And it talks about a lot of different cases where professionals, members of regulated professions like accountants, lawyers, nurses, doctors, and psychologists have been sanctioned or disciplined by the regulator for things that they said, off-duty things that they said that the regulator thought were very naughty and they should be punished for. And of course, the most famous of these cases is Jordan Peterson's, a case that we were involved in. And everyone who tweeted this obviously had not read the paper, and they only focused on how much they hate Jordan Peterson. And a lot of people tweeted things like the following, and I'm going to read one of those. This is in reference to Peterson. It's about professional standards. Freedom of expression is not without responsibility. When a counselor like Jordan Peterson tells someone to kill themselves, then the profession will suggest a refresh course. So that didn't happen. People should stop saying that Jordan Peterson told someone to kill themselves. Obviously, that would result in a different outcome if that had happened. Now, there was a complaint. That was a tweet from a guy named Jack McGraw. And normally I'm not such a jerk to say the random person who tweeted this, but they kept tweeting it after I told them this is not correct. And I cited the exact part of the decision that deals with this. So Jack McGraw, bad legal take. So what did happen was that there was a complaint about Peterson tweeting to someone. This person had been talking about overpopulation of the earth and kind of in histrionic terms. And Peterson replied, "You're free to leave at any point." But that tweet did not result in discipline. And I'll read you the paragraph from the decision that talks about that. Dr. Peterson's tweet, in which it was alleged he encouraged people to commit suicide, "You're free to leave at any point." The panel, the discipline panel, said, finding that while provocative and inflammatory, it could be interpreted as innuendo, a joke, or parody, and it did not rise to the level of disgraceful, dishonorable, or unprofessional conduct. So no, he was not subject to any discipline for telling someone to kill themselves. That just didn't happen. And Jack McGraw was not the only person to tweet this. There's a well-known criminal defense lawyer from Ottawa who tweeted something similar. I corrected him as well, also citing the exact portion of the decision that deals with this. I would read the tweet, but he's deleted it. So at least, unlike Jack McGraw, this criminal defense lawyer was slightly humbled by tweeting about a case he hadn't read, tweeting incorrectly about a case he hadn't read. So that's good. Anyway, there were a lot of tweets about this. A lot of people saying Peterson told someone to kill themselves. He did not. And there was no discipline for that. There was discipline for his comments on social, political, and cultural issues. And that's the whole problem with his case. There should not be discipline for that type of thing. Joanna, what's your bad legal take this week?
Okay, my bad legal take again goes to UK authorities, specifically the Crown Prosecution Service and the Metropolitan Police, who have charged 21-year-old Black woman named Jamila Abdi with a hate crime for using the N-word in a tweet to another Black woman about a football player named Alexander Isaac. And she said, "I'm so pissed off. Let me get my hands on that. Bleep, bleep." She was charged with making a post which the Metropolitan Police claim conveyed a message which was indecent or grossly offensive for the purpose of causing distress or anxiety to the recipient or to any other person. First of all, I don't think that this is an appropriate characterization. There's a concept in criminal law called de minimis, like a little tweet is just not indecent or grossly offensive. But they also say, the Crown Prosecution Service also says, being from an ethnic minority does not provide a defense to racially abusing someone. Okay, first of all, we don't grant that this is racially abusing either the footballer or the other woman to whom the tweet was directed. But I have two things to say. First of all, if this is the case, that using the N-word is a hate crime, how do you explain the whole rap industry? Like, are you just going to ban, are you going to, lock up Jay-Z, Rihanna, Beyonce? Like, how does that work? And second of all, and this is a little bit of a hot
It's the UK,
take,
they probably will.
but I'm sorry, Black people are allowed to use the N-word. I'm sorry. It's just true. I have no opinion about it. I will not weigh in, but it's just true that Black people are allowed to use the N-word. So it doesn't mean that a Black person could not commit a hate crime against another Black person or any other person. But that context, like that, let's not be too cute. Let's not pretend that it doesn't matter. So yeah, horribly bad legal take. You guys are not acquitting yourselves well, Metropolitan Police and CPS. Like, get a reality check.
Indeed. All right, that's the end of the show. It's show number 52. We've done 1 year. We should celebrate at some point. We still hope you'll rate us, review us, and subscribe. And you can support our work by subscribing to the CCF's YouTube channel, by following us on Twitter, or by visiting our website, theccf.ca, where you can sign up for our new and improved Freedom Update newsletter. The CCF is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please click that donate button on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.